All right. Today we are talking about a true giant of modern economics, Christopher Sims. He's the guy who developed a tool that completely changed how we think about cause and effect in the economy. You know, he basically forced a whole generation of economists to stop telling the data what to think and instead to actually start listening to what it had to say.
So let's start with a really basic but super tough question. When the central bank raises interest rates, what actually happens next? And more importantly, why? It sounds simple, right? But in the real world, everything is connected. It's this incredibly messy web, and trying to pull on one thread and see what happens is, well, it's the central problem of macroeconomics. And it's the exact problem Christopher Sims took on.
To really get why his work was such a big deal, you have to picture the 1970s. It was a mess. Economists were staring down the barrel of stagflation, this toxic mix of high unemployment and high inflation that, according to their theories, just wasn't supposed to happen. The huge, complicated economic models everyone relied on, they were completely breaking down, giving bad forecasts and even worse policy advice.
And at its heart, this wasn't just a crisis of bad predictions. It was a full-blown crisis of causality. The old tools just weren't cutting it anymore. They couldn't explain what was causing what in this new chaotic economy.
So what were these models? Well, they were these absolute beasts, usually built on Keynesian theory. I mean, we're talking about models with hundreds of equations, all trying to capture some little piece of the economic puzzle. And for a while, they seemed to work okay. But by the 70s, their performance was just tanking. The world had changed, and the models were stuck in the past.
But here's the thing. The problem wasn't just that they were big and clunky. The real issue was buried deep down in their DNA. They were built on a whole set of assumptions about how the economy worked. Assumptions that were about to get a very harsh reality check.
And the person delivering that reality check, that was Christopher Sims. He launched what is probably one of the most influential critiques in all of modern macroeconomics, and he aimed it right at the very foundation of those old models.
In this landmark 1980 paper, a paper called Macroeconomics in Reality, Sims gave the problem a name that just sticks with you: incredible restrictions. And he meant incredible in the most literal sense of the word, not credible, unbelievable. He was basically saying the assumptions these models were built on were just, well, they were fiction.
So what was so unbelievable? Well, first, these models had this super rigid structure. They just hard-coded things based on theory, like assuming that government spending doesn't respond to unemployment. But the biggest problem was that they treated policy changes, like an interest rate hike, as if they came from outer space, completely separate from the economy. Sims's huge insight was, no, in the real world, policymakers react to what's happening. You can't just pretend they don't.
And you know, this wasn't just some abstract academic squabble. This critique and the powerful solution he came up with were so revolutionary that they fundamentally changed how economics is done. And for that, Christopher Sims was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2011. He didn't just find a flaw, he built a better way.
So that brings us to his solution. Instead of forcing a theory onto the data and making it fit, Sims proposed something kind of radical for the time. Why don't we just let the data speak for itself?
His method is called vector autoregression, or VAR for short. The philosophy behind it is simple but so powerful. You treat every major variable, inflation, GDP, interest rates, all of it, as part of one big, interconnected system. You just assume that everything can, and probably does, affect everything else. And instead of starting with a rigid theory, you start with the data and let it show you the patterns.
The best way to think about it is like an ecosystem, right? The weather affects the plants, sure, but the plants also affect the local weather. The number of predators affects the prey, but the amount of prey also determines how many predators can survive. It all flows together. A VAR just applies that same dynamic, holistic view to our economy.
Okay, so if everything affects everything, how in the world do you untangle cause and effect? Well, that's the magic trick. The power of a VAR is how it lets you isolate and trace the impact of a single, unexpected economic shock through the whole system.
And there's a really clean three-step way to think about it. First, you build your VAR model using historical data, and you have it make a forecast. Step 2, you identify the shocks. These are the times when reality didn't match the forecast. You then do some clever statistics to pull out the truly unexpected events. And finally, step 3, you trace the ripples. You map out how the whole system responds over time to that one single shock. That's called an impulse response analysis. All right, theory's great, but let's see how this thing actually works. We'll use a classic example that VAR analysis really helped us understand much better. What happens after a surprise interest rate hike from the central bank?
So this is our impulse, our fundamental shock. Out of the blue, for reasons of its own, the central bank decides to tighten things up and raise rates. It's a surprise. So what does the VAR, having looked at decades of data, tell us happens first? Well, almost immediately, economic activity starts to slow down. Production, growth, they begin to decline. Not a huge crash, but a gradual cooling off. That kind of makes sense. But here's the kicker. This is the part that really surprised people and showed the power of this method. The whole point of the rate hike was to fight inflation, right? Well, VARs showed that inflation, it barely budges at first. In fact, the data consistently shows it can take a year, maybe even a year and a half or more, before inflation really starts to come down. This delayed response is now a bedrock fact of monetary policy, and it's something we learned by letting the data speak. When you put all these different insights together, the result was nothing short of a paradigm shift. Sims' work gave economists a whole new and much more realistic way to actually engage with the data from the real world.
And the legacy is just immense. I mean, today, VARs are a standard go-to tool for pretty much every central bank and finance ministry on the planet. They are absolutely everywhere in academic research. They totally transformed forecasting, uncovered these new stylized facts we just talked about, and this is the big one, they finally gave economists a tool to deal with the fact that policy reacts to the economy.
So, what's the ultimate takeaway here? By calling out those incredible restrictions and building a method that respected the messy, interconnected reality of the economy, Christopher Sims gave us a much, much better map. It's not a perfect map, but it's one that's actually drawn from reality, not just from a textbook.
Which leaves us with a final thought. The tools we have now, thanks to people like Sims, are so much better than they were 50 years ago. And yet, the real world still finds ways to shock us all the time, doesn't it? It just goes to show you that trying to understand this complex economic world we live in, well, it's a journey, not a destination.